But what I find interesting is he grounds it in the experiences which most of us can accept to be real.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. This week's guest is Mark Sollis, a good friend of mine, and we're talking about a book called Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman. Now, if you've heard these According To episodes before, you'll know that this is not a book review, but we're using the book as a lightning rod for the discussion to come. Now, in this discussion, we talk about the age of acceleration, the 3 M's that Friedman brings up: Mother Nature, or climate change; Moore's Law, or technological change; and finally, markets, or globalization. In this conversation, we also address optimism, what it means to be optimistic, what it means to be pessimistic, and perhaps if there's a truth in the middle. Adaptability, which is a key theme of this book and of this conversation, and how human adaptability is perhaps our greatest strength, and how, of course, to leverage that. The fear in the US and other countries of automation, the fact that people would rather give up sex than a smartphone, higher education, inequality, the book being a personal story for Thomas Friedman, and the importance of locality and community. Now, if you like this podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use, and please go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can listen to any other episode and find ways to get in touch with me, to give me your feedback on this episode or any other, and let me know what you think for future guests and future subjects to discuss on this show. I really look forward to hearing from you. It's always a pleasure to get your emails and your feedback on this show. It makes it better every single time. Mark Sollis, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm obviously excited to chat with you. We've been hanging out for the last 24 hours, and I made it a rule that we could not talk about the book that we're talking about today, which is Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations by Thomas L. Friedman. And he's the author of The World is Flat, and that's how I know him when I read that some years ago. This book is really, and it was your recommendation to read this, and I appreciate that, because this book really is an answer to the question, what on earth is going on? And he answers it in about 10,000 different ways. And every single chapter in here is filled not only with stories. He's a great journalist. He writes for the New York Times as a columnist. But it's filled with information about what is going on. And this is written about 3 years ago. So it was written in 2016. And it still presages a lot of what we're talking about today. So I want to say one thing before we start, is that we do know each other. We've tried not to talk about this book over the last day or so. And it's something that I've been really interested for a long time to chat with you, because you, Mark, are a very, not only insightful person, not only a passionate person, but I think that you bring your curiosity to the table in every situation that you're in. You bring an intensity to life that I appreciate. And I think that in your work, it has driven you quite far. So again, I appreciate you coming on the program. And my first question to you is always the same one. But in this one, because this is not a book review, by the way, this is a discussion of the book and a discussion on where this book can take us. It's a launching pad as opposed to a place just to get into it and review it. So according to this book, Thank You for Being Late, Mark, what on earth is going on?
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. And again, thank you for having me. And I love the idea that we're chatting about this book. And part of the backstory on it is that we actually started out with a different book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And one that you'll probably cover at some other time, because it's a phenomenal book too and deserves the discussion. And I think...
Well, you got to mention the book.
Well, the book is Capital, Thomas Piketty, which
Yeah.
I think somebody far wiser than me should cover with you.
And far wiser than me too. It's an intense book, and I was excited to dig into it, but I think the principles in that book are very complicated in terms of economics and mathematics, but the truth of it remains the same. And I think it is connected to actually Thank You for Being Late. Yeah. The idea that wealth generates more return than wage labor does over time. Yeah. And that puts us in a very precarious situation with growing inequality. And Friedman talks about that in his book.
Yeah. So I remember the time, because I remember it was a few weeks ago now, that it gently hinted that maybe we'd want to consider a different book, and then maybe less gently hinted and finally straight out asked, hey, would you mind if we covered this book? And the reason was, and you just raised it, There's something about the way that Friedman explores this subject matter that, beyond being more accessible, I'm decent with complicated materials. I can eventually figure it out. But it's that I think the premise of the book is what really started to sing to me. And so I would suggest, in my reading of it, that the kind of what on earth is going on from Friedman, it's obviously is a fairly long title, right? So it's this idea of an age of acceleration. So he is exploring acceleration in three areas. He's really the three M's: the Mother Nature, Moore's Law, and market. And specifically in the Mother Nature piece, it's about the changing climate conditions and climate effects. In the idea of market, he's talking about globalization. We're much focused on this expanse of a global community, a global market community. And then Moore's Law, of course, as most of us would know it, and is this notion of technology and the rapid change in technology. And what I love is that he explores these spaces independently and then weaves them together to say that really this is an examination of where we are in today, because these three forces, more than any other, are causing, or collectively influencing, causing, for us, we're experiencing change in a way that, like no other time. Doesn't mean that other generations or centuries haven't experienced change, but it's because of these three particular elements that are driving us there. And he's going to suggest to us, and there's another key word in here, and it's the word optimist, right? So many people I know are interested in those spaces either independently or collectively. For me, though, I tend to be a glass half full person, not always, and I love this notion that we're at a time like no other. And so when I'm reading Friedman and he's starting to talk about these spaces, he's doing it in a way of saying, okay, there are some things that are, and some things that, and he uses a lot of proof points in the book to demonstrate the stories or the assumptions he's putting out there. He goes to the individual story, but then brings it back to this notion of an optimist guide. This is where we are. These are the forces that we're now facing. It's not about questioning whether they exist or not. They're here. They are here. But now what do we do with it? How do we actually respond to it? How do we use it to generate a dialogue in the community? How do we use it in policy development? Obviously, I have some interest in politics and policy. For me, education. How do we use it in terms of educating people, not just in the traditional means, but as ourselves as lifelong learners is a cliche term. We should be experiencing life on a regular basis. We should be adjusting.
Friedman does talk about lifelong learning and how critical that is to a modern economy. But I want to go back to this notion, well, first of all, of optimism. He actually interviews someone in the book, and they say, I'm not an optimist, but nor am I a pessimist. I apply hope. And the point of that is saying that if you're an optimist or a pessimist, you're essentially saying that fate is not in my hands. It's going to happen, and I believe that it will be good, or I believe it will be bad. And the problem with that is that we forget that we can actually change our circumstances as human beings, as societies, and change culture as well. But I do want to go back to Moore's Law, which is not only, the three M's, Moore's Law, Mother Nature, and markets, this driving acceleration. If someone were to say to me in my question, what on earth is going on? And they were to say those three things, I don't know what's not captured in there in terms of the human experience. And that's one thing where I think he got it really right. And Moore's Law is this, well, do you want to define Moore's Law? What is Moore's Law, Mark?
Moore's Law, the notion that in the technology or that in that space, the digital space, that every 2 years we're seeing a doubling of the capacity of whatever that particular element is. In most cases, they're talking about the processing speed of computers and et cetera. Right. But I think they've made the point here. You can now just apply that to just about anything in this digital space. That the technology is coming on stream, and our ability, because he moves away from hardware now to software. Right in the book, and starts to talk about the application of Moore's Law. Originally was about hardware, the capacity of hardware. And in fact, now we're looking at the capacity of software. Software is how we unleash the potential of most of what we have now available to us.
Right. And what's so interesting about this accelerating growth of technology is that we human beings don't actually have the capacity to understand exponential growth, which is what Moore's Law is. If something just, increases by 5 every year, that's not exponential growth. That's geometric growth. Exponential growth is where it doubles, and then that doubles, and then that doubles. So he goes back to this theme, this metaphor of the chessboard, and that we are currently halfway through the chessboard. And what he's saying about that is that, there's a story back in the day, a mathematician made a bet with the king or the leader of some society, I can't remember where it was, and said, if I solve this problem for you, you have to pay me 1 piece of wheat per week for every square on the chessboard, and then double it for every subsequent square.
And ends up at 18 quintillion.
Right, which is a ridiculous and impossible
number. And if you looked at the chessboard, you'd never say to yourself, 18. If someone said, so what does that look like at the end? They would never guess 18 quintillion.
And nobody would, because we don't, as human beings, don't comprehend exponential growth that easily. We would just say, you're an idiot. 1, and then 2, and then 4. I'm sure it'll be fine. We'll end up at 64 or 128 by the end of the board. But of course, it becomes this ridiculous number. And what Friedman constantly says is the refrain of, we're only about halfway through the chessboard of technological acceleration, that we have a lot further to go, and we won't be able to comprehend the accelerations that are yet to come, whether they're artificial intelligence, machine learning. And of course, there is this other element to it, which is that our societies, our institutions, can't keep up with that. If Moore's law is one accelerating line up into the stratosphere, the growth of our social contract and social understandings is actually not flat, but it's not rising nearly as quickly, and that leads to a lot of the disruptions that we see today.
Yeah. So there's an important graph. Thank you for raising for that, because I looked at the graphs on page 36 so if I'm reading the book, at least in my copy. Because Moore's law, and you're right, the exponential growth, so we're now at a point where the curve starts to just shoot up. But the other thing that he puts on in that same graph is the human adaptability piece. And that itself is not a linear line. It's starting to curve. And so one of the things that he explores a bit, and that I certainly am intrigued by now and wanted to go on to read more about, I wonder what a human adaptability, what that line eventually looks like. Like, I wonder how, as an individual or a society or as a community, and maybe it's in different space, different ways. I work in education, so I don't know that our adaptability in education is necessarily legendary. I think we tend to be on a slow curve. It improves all the time. Whereas if you're working in Silicon Valley, probably your conditions around adaptability are a little bit more natural, let's say. But collectively, whether that adaptability curve starts to shift as well, so that we will probably never be at the place where we can be completely comfortable with these forces of disruption, like Moore's law is suggesting, at the same pace, but that we might be more comfortable, either as individuals or collectively, that the idea that change is upon us becomes more natural, right? Because of the speed. Because eventually, otherwise it would snap, right? Otherwise, what happens is we have so many things that could be available to us, and that's his point he's making, and that it doesn't matter because we can adapt to those. That somehow the speed. I mean, there's a point in the book they make around every 5 to 7 years, right? The world changes. Society fundamentally changes. And there is, if you don't mind, there's a quote in the book I want to read because it just, I think, captures it perfectly. This notion, and it's not from him, it's from Friedman. The world is not just rapidly changing, it is being dramatically reshaped. So it's not about change, it's fundamentally changing. And the timeline I know they use in the book is this 5 to 7 years. It is starting to operate differently. And so for me, and it goes on to talk about it happening faster than we've been able to reshape ourselves. That's the whole point about adaptability. But if you're talking about a fundamental reshaping versus just change, right? And it's happening at a pace of every 5 to 7 years, aren't we as people going to be, I don't want to say forced, but aren't we going to be drawn to being more adaptable ourselves? And let's be honest, day to day, I see examples of it all the time, right? So with the obvious cliche example is a smartphone. Right. Most people are very, very comfortable with a smartphone, almost regardless of generation now. I think with the cliche of your grandma can't use a smartphone, maybe not the same as you, but I can tell you there's a lot of people older than me who can use them much better than I can. The point is you adapt. 20 years ago, if I started talking about what a smartphone could do, we would have no concept of that. And so we've adapted to that simple piece of technology. Now, that's one aspect. But that, I guess it goes to my thinking about it. Well, yeah, we're not as adaptable to the speed at which technology and it goes on to the other two of market and environment are bringing to us. But we are more adaptable than I think we give ourselves credit for.
Well, is this the key theme of the book, the key question that Friedman is asking, which is adaptability? I mean, he talks about Darwin and says that it wasn't actually Darwin who said this, but essentially that, the change of species in accordance to their environments and the ability for a species to survive has nothing to do with strength, but adaptability. And that humans have succeeded for so long, not because we're strong, but because we're adaptable, because we can take our environment and we can learn from it, we can make it into our own, and we have the capability to to be stronger as a result of adaptability, not the other way around. So, it seems to me that this is the key challenge that he is giving to I guess, our species in this book is you better adapt to this because it's happening whether you like it or not. And it's not, of course, just Moore's Law. It's the market, but it's also Mother Nature. We have this cataclysmic potential event coming of our climate changing to a point that we can no longer survive on this planet as our habitat. And that adaptability requires us to change our ways of doing things, but also perhaps avoid this, again, apocalypse if it's going to be coming that way. And we may not be equipped to do so. And so I know that you're an optimist, and I know that Friedman is an optimist. It's on the title of his book. But what reasons do you have to believe that we are adaptable enough to face these challenges and overcome them?
I might flip that question a little bit. I don't know that I have reasons to believe that we're going to adapt, right? And I think that's different. And you made the point earlier about an optimist versus a pessimist, right? So that would be saying we've got it, no problem. That's not what I think he's saying, and that's not actually what I believe. What I believe is we have the potential to do so, and that in fact there are examples around me all the time where I think the world gets better. And I think the point of the book is that this is available to us now. Mother Nature is a force, and we're addressing that. We've actually caused as much as we're experiencing Mother Nature. Some of the examples in the Moore's Law are the market areas. So when we talk about technology, we talk about globalization. He gives a number of examples where that's actually been an aid, an access point for individuals to come into a place in society which they would have not had before, that it has, while it has complicated, it has eased our lives in many ways, that it can address things. I love the health example when he talks about, early on, he makes reference to the use of technology and digital, particularly digital, the use of digital in the health profession. And it's not to replace doctors. It's because the volume of knowledge that's available to any health professional monthly is more than any one person can actually literally consume. It's not just metaphorically consume. They literally could not consume it. So why wouldn't you give the best knowledge available to the doctors at a drop of a hat, treat it, and have them use their skills, right? But informed by this wonderful technological backstop, which is essentially, in this case, it was an encyclopedic knowledge of just about every current practice of medicine that was coming out. So you have that ability to use that. That to me is brilliant. That's us adapting. That's saying it's not about the country doctor. It hasn't been about that for a long time. Most of our lifetimes, we've never seen that form of medicine. But this now gives individuals access to a body of knowledge that would have been unthinkable. Like that's the optimist side of saying that it's potentially available to us. We have to use it. And that's where I think when I read something like Friedman, and I will say this book is now one of the first things that goes in my suitcase, right? And it covers with me everywhere. And part of it is because I'm using it currently as reference. Part of it is because there are so many stories in here, I'm still unpacking them all, that lead me to believe we have the potential to address these things. And there's a lot of books on commentary out there, tons, right? And they comment on climate conditions, or they comment on the economy, and there's some that are optimistic in the definition of the word, saying everything's gonna be fine, and then there are some that are pessimistic and say that the world's over. This one doesn't do that. This one says this is what is, and here's how they're connected, and then here's our potential to address it. And that's why it sings.
Right. And like we were saying before, it's applied hope as opposed to just blind optimism. How can we apply the wish that we want to be better, and that we want to, if Moore's Law and Mother Nature and the markets are going like a hockey stick graph, right? So then it just shoots up in a way that we can't possibly adapt on our current trend. How do we bridge that difference? Can we? I think we agree that we can. Thomas Friedman simply believes that we can. But we have to make a lot of big decisions in order to do so, collectively, but also individually. And there's this really interesting idea in the book of not only acceleration, but the ability for human beings to match that through ingenuity. This idea that the changing paradigm of our time is not accumulating stock anymore, not accumulating a bunch of stuff in our home, not accumulating a bunch of money even, and especially in terms of education, which is your bailiwick, not accumulating a lot of knowledge so that finally I'm ready, I've capped it off, I'm going to go into my career. But rather, the new paradigm is having access to the flows of information, because no one can accumulate all the stock in the world. There's too much. By Moore's Law, we've accelerated so much that you now have to have access to the flow and have something that enables you to do so. And one other point that goes with this is something that's counterintuitive, that any historian of, say, the Industrial Revolution would be able to tell you, and any economist who'd studied bank tellers in the 1980s and 90s would tell you. And it's an example that Friedman uses in the book, that if you were to ask anybody who hasn't read this book, who doesn't know this example, about bank tellers, in the 1980s when ATMs first started being installed all over the Western world, bank tellers obviously were, being put out of work, because what are they going to do now? There's a machine that's doing it for you. What's counterintuitive is that we actually have more bank tellers today than we did then. Not only that, but the profession of bank tellers has grown faster than average professions. Why would that be? It's quite simply that banks can now have more branches. And at the more branches they have, they still need employees to do other things, not being a bank teller, not counting up numbers, but being a communicator and being a social agent in that bank to bring people in. And just like cotton weaving back in the Industrial Revolution, the machines didn't displace people, they just forced them to do different work because the demand for cotton went through the roof as it became so cheap. And these are things that we can't predict. There's going to be other changes like this that may not completely disrupt the world of work, but simply force us to look at it in a different way.
Yeah, I think the bank tellers one is a great one, because again, the point of the book is to educate, to inform, to help us understand and appreciate. Most of us, can remember a time when ATMs were not as dominant as they are now. The idea of contactless payments, that kind of thing. And his point in the book is that it's not just that there were going to be less, or there were less bank tellers. It was that the fear that there was going to be less, and eventually none. Like, that was real, and and in fact, exactly the opposite happened. Right?
And we're having the same fears today with automation.
Exactly, and so this is where, great, that's a nice story. We've all adapted, and bank tellers have different parts of their tasks, parts of their role in your experience with financial institutions is just different than it was back in the day when you're walking in with your check or your bag of money to cash your paycheck. I can't fathom the idea of cashing a paycheck now, and yet I definitely cashed a paycheck when I started out way back when I was all of 13 years old. And so we can look south of the border. I try not to do that a lot because I think it's too cliche. You can look
to the United States.
Yeah, and I'm thinking literally where we're sitting across the lake to some of that particular area of the U.S.
We're in Kingston. Yeah. I've got to remind our listeners where we are.
Well, I think, and when we look across Lake Ontario, we can look down to the Rust Belt, and you think, yeah, what's the fear there? The fear is that what we're experiencing, and let's be clear, Friedman's American, and a lot of the stories he uses, particularly later on, are an American reference point. So you have to work to put them into your own community, which I'm quite comfortable doing and quite happy to do so. Because I think he's making the case later on, which I know we'll get to, is that, okay, well, this is what is, right? So in some of those communities, and I've never been to Kingston before. I've actually never been to the Rust Belt, but I started to think about the book as I was flying in yesterday. Interesting. Can these people working in some of those industries down there conceive of a space in which they personally, as an individual and as a collective, will benefit from this? They will benefit from technology. They will benefit from some of the changes that are either happening, things like climate change, or that are available to us, right? Market conditions, globalization, those forces, that there'll be an eventual benefit to them. The answer right now, I'd suggest, was for many people, no. And in fact, that's what I think some of the people in some of the policy environments and some of this are preying on, is that they can conceive of it. The bank teller example, do we know? None of us know what will happen in the automobile industry or in some of the industries that are being automated. None of us has that ability. I promise you, not a human being on the planet actually has that, based on the book, right? That's what he's saying, and I happen to agree with him, because we can't conceive of something 25 years out, because we can't conceive of what will be able to us. But so many people are just conceiving that it'll be negative. Like, well, I won't have the same job I had for the last 20 years. And the answer would be, you're right. Like, you just won't. And so, but that could actually be a real positive thing if we demonstrate the same ingenuity as they use in the ATM example, or that we take control of these forces and say, well, this is what is, right? And so what does that mean? And it doesn't mean simply saying to your person who's worked in a particular task, oh, well, we're going to retrain you in a completely different craft. Well, because that's been some of the policy stuff that's come out, and I look at that and go, that's also a little bit bizarre, right? I mean, that's hard to hear, but what you can say is, what are the I work in education. So what are the skills that we are giving people so that one thing we know is they have to be able to adapt. So what skills can they acquire? And I don't mean skills. I mean, I have no skills in terms of manual labor. So it's not about knocking two boards together. It's the ability to learn. It's the ability to adapt. It's the ability to be part of a team. And he covers this in the book as well. So that when inevitably the next change comes, that those individuals are comfortable moving through a reasonable transition. I mean, the point around adaptability is clear. It's like you can't just disrupt people's lives constantly. But that is what we're about to experience. What's happening now, and this is another reason I'm personally interested in the book, is because I think we have to tell a better story in some of the groups that I'm involved in why this change is happening and why it can be positive. What can we do about it, as opposed to coming down to some binary of this is good or this is bad, right? And
yeah, it sounds like what we need to do as individuals is find a way to have no longer a linear line, but a curved line in our own life, the ability to adapt. So AT&T is an example that Friedman uses in the book, and essentially says that when they partnered with iPhone in 2006, 2007, and agreed to be the sole supplier of iPhone in the United States, they essentially knew that they were going to have to increase their capability to deliver phone calls and, of course, data to a huge degree. They couldn't even predict how much that was. From 2007 to 2014, the infrastructure required went up by 100,000 times. So the 100,000 times as much data was used through AT&T's network over the 7-year period, just like the time frame you mentioned a few minutes before, right? This 5 to 7 year period of adjustment. That's massive. But they knew it was coming, and they were able to adjust, and they were able to build a curve. And AT&T says now to its employers, if you're willing to be a lifelong learner, then you will be a lifelong employee of AT&T. And it sounds to me like that's going to become the norm across all businesses. And there's a word for this in this book, and I know you're excited about it because you broke the rule and you talked about the book with me before this conversation, so I know you know what this word is. Mark, what is stempathy?
Yeah, this idea of stempathy, because again, we most of us know what STEM is, and I know lately there's a little bit of movement to try to make that STEAM, this idea of science, tech, the math.
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Yeah. And you can see how much I'm interested in STEM because I've clearly forgotten the word. I know what it is. In the sense, it's around those hard sciences.
And STEAM is putting arts into it. Yeah.
So there's the movement to get arts in there, which was probably more my interest. Like, great, let's make sure we don't lose part of what's important in society as well. So some of the arts, the space that can illuminate with richness some of the other things we do.
Although, as a quick tangent, there's a fun. I don't know if you know the comedian Patton Oswalt, but they were doing this when he was in school, and they taught him a class, physics for poets. Yeah. And he just spent 5-10 minutes lampooning this idea of trying to teach poets physics, but really bringing these things together, because the pool and the ability to access knowledge has to be united and heterodox, which is another word that Friedman uses, as opposed to siloed. Yeah. Anyways.
So what I like about the stempathy term that I read through, and it caught me right away, pull out my little stickers, throw down a sticker on that page, because it's the notion, okay, we do need to have skills in these spaces around the hard sciences, and we probably need more of them now than in some spaces than we might have thought for. But the empathy piece comes from the other things we need to actually learn and experience and grow and be adaptable to. This notion of, and we see it. It's not that it's not there. There's lots of conversations inside universities. There's lots of conversations inside teams and inside organizations that I've worked in around these skills. But it's this notion of, okay, let's bring those together now. We need communication skills. We need the ability to adapt. We need the ability to work in groups. We need the ability to have a better read on the experience of others, and both individually and collectively, so that we can, whether we're in the customer service business, whether we're in the technology business, whatever it is, that we can actually put ourselves, my reading is we put ourselves in the shoes of others, and therefore start to use both our hard skills, but with our soft, this is the old language that some people use, but the hard skills and the soft skills, and bring them together, and that those individuals will ultimately be very, very successful, or can be very successful, because they have the knowledge. That was the piece. You have knowledge, but you also have the ability to learn. You have the ability to learn and grow and adapt. And when you take those things together, the knowledge, foundational knowledge, which again, be clear, he's not suggesting, nor would you and I think, that you don't need to have some core skills in order to be successful. I can't just suddenly say, okay, that's it. I'm not going to school. Don't need any of these things. No. We need some of those core skills. There is a point though where those foundational skills, right, are not enough in themselves. You need to have these other pieces. And I know one thing I say, and sometimes gets me in trouble, but I've stood in front of a room and said, I guarantee inside X university, whichever one, or X, there's something that we're teaching that will be redundant by the time the person graduates. It's not because we don't know what we're doing. Right? I'm also quick to say the second bit. It's because the pace of change around the actual, what is that element of knowledge, that one single nugget of knowledge, becomes either outdated, untrue. Right? I grew up when Pluto was a planet. And if you'd asked me as a kid, Pluto was a planet. I had my little model with my little styrofoam balls that I did for science fair in grade 4 or 5, and there was always 9 planets, and Pluto was there. Suddenly, Pluto's not a planet, and then we're not sure, and we get everything. And I'm thinking, but if you had asked someone in my childhood, Pluto was a planet. It was a fact, right? And so, so there's something we're teaching that becomes untrue or puts in a different context. And so this idea that he's exploring around, we want to take knowledge and marry that to learning and the ability to adapt is, I think, should speak to many of us. It certainly speaks to me. It's saying, great, I am now at an age where the things I knew, and I just gave you a very cliche example again with Pluto, and I tend to do that because most people would know that there's been jokes about the whole Pluto thing. But I apply that to lots of the ways in which I live. Things I thought were true because I was taught them are no longer, they're in most cases outdated. It's not that they're untrue now, it's that they're outdated.
One thing that I wanted to highlight so far in my conversation with Mark Sollis is something that he said, that there are things that we're teaching a student right now that will be redundant by the time that student graduates. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about this concept of future proofing, something you may have heard of before. But this is where I'm really glad to be talking to my friend Mark, because he's not afraid to tell me when he disagrees. And he makes it really clear that future proofing, no matter what we do and no matter how hard we try, future proofing is based on the context and the understanding that we have now. Anyways, all of this is coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Well, there's an underside to this too, which is, why do we resist change that in the case of Pluto is actually completely harmless, right? There's a huge, remaining to this day, a backlash against Pluto being declassified as a planet. And it really doesn't matter, but the only reason we hold on to it is because we treat the things that we learned as children as sacred. We treat the knowledge base as sacred, and then someone's trying to change it. And it goes classically to the arguments that we constantly have in our public discourse, which is, the world is changing too quickly, and I'm going to resist it because I like how my world was back in the day. And it may simply be this reduction of elasticity for people as they get older, right? And becoming more and more hardened in their beliefs, and that might just be the way we are as humans. But if we're going to adapt, we're going to have to be able to open ourselves up and, again, have our line curve a little bit more easily towards the hockey stick. There's this line in the book, which is that if there's something that's not being done, it's because you're not doing it. And for a 50-year-old, let alone a 70-year-old or a 20-year-old, that lesson has to be the same. And Friedman doesn't talk about age so much, but he does talk about being stuck in our old ideas and unable to be empirical and rational and thoughtful as opposed to orthodox and ideological, and how damaging those things can be. And that's one thing I think as an author, as a public intellectual, he's good at, which is to say, hang on a second, before you bring your ideology into the room, ask yourself, what's just basically going on here?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And come back to a piece that you said, because I've actually been knowing this was coming up, and we were going to have a conversation. I thought, okay, let's think about this notion of change and resistance to change, and whether that's actually true. In thinking about Friedman, how he covers the material, I think we should question that, because when I look around me day to day, I flew here, I had to fly from a different city. And so went through an airport, was on a plane, watched people in smartphones, took an Uber when I came to the Kingston airport to come and see you.
And then once you got here, you had to get in horse and buggy to come all the way here. We're living in the Stone Age
That's
here.
Right, exactly. Well, I walked around and looked at the houses here, and I'll tell you, I'm going to use a house one example in a second because I've just finished living in the UK. I think when some of this change is upon us, and again, I was probably thinking it more from the technology standpoint than I was other. But I often think about global forces in terms of market, and particularly around learning. When it is abundantly clear there's a positive impact to my personal circumstance, I'm very comfortable with change regardless of whether I'm a Luddite or not. I am. And you see it in cars and the technology available to us in cars, the idea that you can now push a button on your key, or you walk by your car and the boot opens up, and you look and go, oh, I like that. Well, you didn't have that in the 1970s. And so, no, you don't actually want your life to go back to what it was in any way. No one does, right? You love the fact that you can go on your digital box, for many of us, and record a show and watch it or call it back. Well, you couldn't do that. So, in fact, lots of changes happen. People, regardless of ideology, are universally excited about, right? And we'll use the houses one, because we are in Kingston, older houses around us. I live in the UK. We love the romantic ideal of a beautiful old castle or some stonework, and the things that were built when now they're probably cost prohibitive or just not done. Live in one of those? What do you try to do? You try to modernize the inside. Most people would not want to live in a castle from 200 years ago without all of the modern comforts within it. They like it's a romantic piece. And I did. This is something that's really struck me over the last couple of years, is that, yeah, I'd love the face to look like a castle, but inside, I want to be able to walk in and have my lights be, turned on by sound, and I want, all of the things that you want, the modern comforts. And so, no, we're very good about adapting to change when it suits us. And then many of us, if something new comes on stream, we have a learning piece, right? And this is probably the interesting bit, the learning piece where we have to learn the technology or learn how to use it. We see the benefit, we don't quite know. Once we learn and know, then we become really comfortable. And then there's a couple things, and quite rightly so, people say, no, I'm not interested. That is not, and that's a bit of the pushback you see now in we see it in probably the discourse of the public, where, no, I want to turn off my phone for a couple of days, or I want to do this. There are some things about those times of past which I want to return to for either a period of time or because I have a personal preference. But it's not universal. Most people actually, I would challenge most people, there's always going to be one soldier out there who thinks differently, to say, would you really like to go back and live your life exactly as it was in 1955? Would you really like to do that? Would you like to go back and live your life exactly as it was in 1985? And I'll tell you, the answer is no. Would I like some pieces of it? Sure. I was an outdoor sports kid, so I'd like to see more of that because I think it's actually healthy and it's enjoyable. And I still do that even at this kind of getting up there years. But would I like some of the other pieces that I have now? Oh, yeah. I'm not giving away my digital box for anything. My smartphone, you'd have to pry that out of my hands, right? I'm the NRA guy, except with my smartphone. It's like out of my cold, dead hands. I'm taking that thing with me wherever I go. That might actually come in my coffin, right?
Well, there's a part in the book where it actually says that people would rather give up things before they give up their smartphone, and it's absurd.
Yeah.
Like they would rather. I can't even remember some of the examples.
I do know one of the examples, but we probably
No, go for it. What is it?
Sex is one.
Right. Yes. I would rather give up sex for a year than give up my smartphone, or give up my smartphone, which is absurd. Yeah. But to a digital native, someone who is younger than us, they might actually say, well, of course, because. Giving that up is giving up like an appendage to me, or a prosthetic, or my arm is being cut off in a way. And I can imagine someone saying, "I'd rather not have sex than lose my arm."
But I think the piece. So you made it earlier, and I want to come back to it because I think it's important with Friedman. For quite a long time, we had the conversation. It was based on age. Like if you're a certain generation, you thought a certain way, and I think that's what he does well. It says we're here now. Right? Friedman's older than us, right? And so we are here now, and so. This adapting to change, adapting to a global environment, literally a global market environment and a global environment, adapting to technology. Across the generations, we've now done that to a certain point, and we're going to continue to do that. And so this notion, and when you come back to the smartphone one, it's not just a 20-year-old that would rather have their smartphone. I'm not 20. You know that, and anyone looking at me can tell that. So I wish.
You do pretty well, Mark.
I'm holding on. I'm hanging in there. So thankfully. Many things worked against me, but genetically, I at least have hair.
Well, there is a reason we're doing this on a podcast and not video.
There you go. So thanks.
You're welcome. Anytime.
For any of the listeners, it's not that bad. So, but my peer group, we're just as technologically dependent, I would argue, so I work again in education, and I hear things around me, or I hear to my peer group, and they assign attributes to young people. Like we say things which I think it's lazy thinking, right? Kids don't play outside like we did when we were kids. No, they don't, but I don't know that we do either in the way that we used to. I don't turn my own butter and go all the way back, right? But I also don't do the things that my parents did when in the 80s or 90s because I have other things available to me. I have tools. I come back to the smartphone. People my generation, so have smartphones, use them all the time, and they're dependent on them as the 18-year-old. I'm sorry, that is the truth. I watch it happen all the time. In there's lots of other examples where people are consuming what's available to us now that we didn't have before, and that's, I mean, you go back to the book, he continues to he uses examples of not just your 15-year-old saying, this is what we have to prepare ourselves for. This is the world today in which we all are living, regardless of age, regardless of cultural background, regardless of country. Because the other thing that's really important here is a number of the examples he pulls are global examples. So he doesn't just use Silicon Valley and parts of the Brazilian rainforest and New York financial trade corridor or to trade area or London to prove it. He talks a bit. I mean, I love the example of Batman just because of the city reference, if nothing.
In Turkey.
Yeah, exactly. It's this wonderful hub of media. Like essentially the idea there is to assemble media coverage and social media coverage of your particular story, your name, whatever you pay for the service, and then he provides service to jurisdictions, governments, businesses all over the world from this place in Turkey, which probably most of us have never heard of, and I certainly had heard before I read the book. You would go, well, that's a Silicon Valley thing. If you told the story, like, oh, somebody's doing that, or they're probably doing it in a major center. No, they're doing it out there. So he uses lots of global examples. So for me, the important piece is this: regardless of where we are, regardless of our cultural background, regardless of our age, we are experiencing this understandably differently. I'm not going to suggest that somewhere in a developing nation that everything's available to them they might be in, say, downtown Toronto. But it is becoming more universal. And that in itself, again, is another appealing part of the way he tells the story, because he is very global in terms of it being an individual. I like the mindset, and I think he invites us to think about it differently. It's not lazy thinking. It is not, oh, young people today, It's, no, it's here. It's here for all of us.
But there is one thing that he brings up right at the beginning of the book, and it's actually the reason for the title, Thank You for Being Late, and it's why he titled the book that way. He realized a few years ago when he started writing this book that he wasn't taking pauses at all, and that if someone were late to a meeting with him, he would actually say, thank you for being late because you gave me 5 or 10 minutes to think and reflect and not rush to fill that time, rush to fill the void with my phone, with Netflix, with a conversation with somebody else. And that pause is, for him, it's what this whole book is. Let's take a step back. Let's take a pause like we don't seem to do anymore and reflect on our situation. And there's one thing that I think, given your, where you are in your career, Mark, and how you're thinking about education, you've been forced to take a pause in your life, and you've been forced to read this and take a pause and think about the world. And through that, I wanted to ask you a question about education, which is, it sounds like you're an optimist, or you're an applied hoper, if we can call it that. You're applied hopeful about the world around us. Are you just as optimistic about educational institutions, about higher education? Do you think that they have it in them, or they as plural? I mean, do you think that the university can not only continue to exist, but to thrive in the 21st century as we are forced to see it today? Can they bridge the gap between the linear curve that most humans are on and this hockey stick graph that we have to curve up to?
I'm going to preface the answer because, like most things, you can't make a blanket statement about every entity within. It's like saying, do I think business is going to be able to adapt to the changing conditions? Some extremely well.
Right.
And some not so well. And we have examples of that. I mean, I like to tell the story when I'm working inside any higher ed education institution. The Kodak one. Everyone knows the Kodak story. It's covered in the business books. Kodak doesn't adapt. Kodak dies. What was really interesting to me was it's not just that Kodak didn't adapt, it's that their customers didn't adapt. Like, if their customers were screaming, they eventually did. They eventually said, oh, I'm not interested in one. They went and bought it. But if it would have been more of a gentle transition, then Kodak probably, I don't know, I didn't work in Kodak, but I'm guessing they would have read the tea leaves because you would have seen it. So I wonder, so then if I think about that example, does that make sense?
Yeah.
That there was suddenly a bolt moment, and they just kind of went over here, and then now this company, they didn't respond well, and someone who knows that story better than me and has studied more will do a much better job of it. But this is an average layperson from the outside looking at it. I go, interesting. It's not just the company. Something happened there that they found themselves caught. And the reason I use that as an example is because I wonder in the education space, right? So I think some institutions probably won't need to adapt because there's something about them that makes them truly unique within the space of education. There's a couple of named examples. I won't use them because it's not fair to the others that I think about when I use the stories. I think some won't, and I think we'll end up having their moment where, now I think most will transition in terms of how we teach, and you can see great examples all over the place, and there's lots of fine universities and fine higher education institutions across Canada and lots of other places. So I think they'll adapt. I think they'll change the way we teach. I think they'll change the way we acquire knowledge. They may look at some really fundamental different things. However, I do wonder whether some of us will get caught, right, not making the move quick enough, and some other force, and this is just my personal perspective, is that some other force will drive us to that change, simply take over a space that we used to think was ours, because they'll be quicker at it, they'll come on the stream. And that's what I mean. It's not that some of us will see it coming, will move, not maybe quick enough, and something else will come in its place that'll address some of what we're talking about here, the adaptability piece in particular, and that whether we are best, and I say we being people who work in higher education, that's the we reference I use, are we set up properly, right, to move quick enough to address the acquisition of this learning versus knowledge, like the ability to learn, the ability to acquire, the ability to learn how to know things we can't possibly conceive of today.
So what separates those who will survive and thrive from those who will fail? And I ask this because I'm using the example of, in my head, Blockbuster and Netflix. Back in the early 2000s, both of those companies were doing essentially the same thing. One was renting movies from retail outlets. The other one was sending them to you in the mail, right? They were both doing an analog approach. One of them was able to say, the world is changing. What are we going to look like in 5 or 10 years? And one of them was not. One of them exists. One of them has one store left in the world. There was a separation there. Maybe one was more small or nimble or capable of thinking on its feet. But there are big companies that can make big changes like this too. AT&T, like we mentioned earlier, was able to do this and shift its whole thinking, like steering a big, huge cruise ship. They were still able to do it and steer in time away from the iceberg that was coming. So is it cultural? Is it leadership? Is it location? What is it that can separate the wheat from the chaff in this example?
Yeah,
and in education?
Yeah, and again, thinking some of my friends and colleagues who work in education might listen to this, hopefully, and may not agree. So, and don't want, because blanket statements are dangerous. I think I'm never going to say, oh, this is what it's going to do. I don't believe that personally, and I don't know that I'm qualified to do that. But someone who's worked in higher ed and worked at senior levels for quite a while, many of the typical, you laid down a few, which I would consider kind of almost demographics of an institution. There's a certain type, or they're at a certain location, or certain. My guess, it is a guess because that's what we're doing here, is that it's going to be exactly what this book is trying to suggest. It's, can you accept the premise of the material here as real? Like, are you in the institution? So it's not enough to just know it. Oh yeah, that's right. You know, we use the smartphone example a lot because it's, for most of us, it is something universally is understood now, and you can do it without that pushback. I do this in some presentations I do. I start to push into other spaces to see where the comfort level is. No, that'll never change, right? And so it's interesting.
But what makes people predisposed to accepting the reality of this book, for example? Like, am I going to appreciate these realities because I have more education, because I'm more nimble, because I'm younger? I mean, if you go into a room of people from universities around the world, some of them will accept it and some won't, but there's a reason for that. Why will some accept? And I know we're dealing with blanket statements and generalizations, but there's a nugget of truth in this it's not just chance. We're not just throwing the dice. Yeah. That what makes people more capable of accepting realities like the ones that Friedman puts forward?
I think Friedman does a really good job in the novel, and this I do model, by the way, some of what I do and some of the work that I do on his style. Doesn't mean there's lots of other thinkers out there that I certainly enjoy in novels, but what I find interesting is he grounds it in the experiences which most of us can accept to be real, right? So whether it's the story, he goes a little bit past that. Right, so you can't just walk in a room and say something that no one in the room can conceive of, right? And we can think about doing that with our friends. They would look at you and go, "What?" And most of us can appreciate that. When you say something that's so beyond what can be conceived of for real for people, it becomes fanciful, and it doesn't. You lose people. It almost becomes the joke of the particular friend group if you say that in front of yours. Stretch a little bit past where you are currently, and suddenly it's like, oh, that's an ambition, that's an aspiration, and so there's a couple of really good examples in the book. And you've asked me about the higher education space. So my sense is, and again, it's just a sense, is that what needs to happen, those that will work best, certainly where I'm interested in spending most of my next kind of era of my career is, can we accept the premise of what he's covering to be real? Can we accept these forces and others, right? And then can we have an honest conversation with ourselves? And I mean, whether it's a single university in a higher education industry, as people who educate, as in my case, and people who work in the bridge between the community and higher ed, that's my role. Can we start to have an honest dialogue with ourselves of what would look differently within what's conceivable for us? The point of this 5 to 7 years, we can't conceive of 10 years. We shouldn't be writing a 50-year strategy for any university, because I can't imagine where you would start. But if we can have an honest conversation with ourselves about some of what's available to us, so it's not about what's changing and we're forced to change. It's what's available to us now that wasn't available to us before. And not just in the classroom, by the way. Like that's the piece in higher ed that I think is going to be interesting. Because it's easy to say in the classroom we should be doing X, Y, Z. Right? Well, no. What about in the other ways in which we operate? What about in the other ways in which the systems work together, an ecosystem of education? What
are the first principles of an education?
Yeah.
Is the first principle a classroom? No, the first principle is learning.
Yeah. So that's there. So that's the space. But I've always, for the most of my career, I've worked in the administrative side. So what are the ways in which the administrative side of this can change, to adapt, to grow? Can we? And in some cases, some have, many very, very well. I think in some cases it's fair to say maybe not as quickly, nor have they. As an industry, have we had an honest dialogue with ourselves? Have we had it at the policy level? I don't. I think there's room for growth there. And I when we talk about who will be successful, my assumption is, or certainly the premise that I'm working from, and spending a lot of time, by the way, reading things like this is why I'm so excited about talking to you about this particular book. When we agreed to do one, let's pick our book, is because this is new for me too. This is really pushing me into spaces and thinking about, okay, interesting premise of these three forces coming together. I've always been on I think things can be better. I think we've got potential. I'm an optimist, and I think we genuinely have the potential to do some really interesting things as a society, as a community, as individuals. But what does that mean for me? What does that mean in the space in which I work? How can I start to learn from these and use some of these examples? How can I work with a group of people? How can I be around my friends in a way that says, I'm not going to be stuck in 2019, because 2028 is going to come around, and I'm hoping that I get to see 2028. And I don't know what it's going to look like now, but I'm going to enjoy it when I get there, right? And so then, okay, so in my professional and personal life, how do I prepare myself for that? And how do I maybe help others prepare for that same thing? And in higher education, I think that's what we need to now do, is say we don't actually know what it's going to look like in such a short time frame. Like, we just don't know. And it's not to then entrench and say, okay, well, let's just be what we are, and we're always going to be a public necessity, a public good, because I happen to believe in education. Obviously, it's my passion. It's that, what does that now look like? And I know some universities are exploring this. There's some examples, and I won't use any by name because it's not fair to others that I would miss, and it's not fair because I've worked for some of them here in Canada. So I'm not to say it's not happening. I just don't know what's happening quick enough and in all areas of the university in which we might do this, right? And I think there's some spaces in higher, and I say universities because that's what I've worked in prior to, but I'd say higher education and education. I did work in K-12 as well years ago. I think we could have a more honest dialogue with ourselves. That's what I believe, and that's just my mark as...
Yeah, and I think it relates back to your example about houses, your analogy about houses and how the exterior may be very different from the interior. And we're always rebuilding our houses. That's what we have to do as human beings. There's no house on the planet that will last forever, let alone the lifetime of our species or our civilization. So we're always having to rebuild where we live, but we also know that history and heritage is important. But we know that when we rebuild a house, there are materials that are important. And I think this actually goes directly to what a university or an educational institution could and should be. what are the first principles of living in a home? Well, you need shelter from the elements. You need to be able to stay warm or cooled in the summer. You need a place to sleep. You need a place to make food, all of these different things. And they are contextual as well. A house in downtown Tokyo is very different from a farm in northern Manitoba, right? And I mean, these are obvious things, but a university or any institution for that matter can adapt in similar ways. And I think that this old idea, it's amazing that it is an old idea now of future-proofing things, right? And so in London on the Underground, you'll go to many stations and the length of the platform is actually twice as long, but you can't see it because they know one day they're going to have to expand. So when they build an underground station, they'll build it twice as big as they need it to be because they are preparing for the future. And the important thing about that for me is when we build a house or when we're building an educational institution or any institution, we can't just build it for this time, now and here that will last forever because we don't know yet. And with the way things are accelerating, the best way I think to build a house is to build one that will accept change 5 years from now, even though we don't know what it is. To be as open as possible. Yes, we might have to tear out the basement and rebuild the foundation, but hopefully not. And to kind of mitigate potential futures is a smart way of doing things. And I don't know to what extent this applies to universities, but it seems to be a kind of a fundamental lesson for living in the 21st century, which is to be open to and adaptable to change.
Yes, the answer is yes to what you said. So from my perspective, but here's something I'd invite us to think about. How do you, because future-proofing we've used a lot. I've been a lot of committee meetings where the term future-proofing comes up and then you sit there and you go, okay, what does that mean? And we talk about it. And this has genuinely struck me many times. We still future-proof within a construct of what we can accept and know, right? So we can't, and so we're talking within a very short time frame here. I mean, the book makes the point, 5 to 7 years is not a long time. A lot of, most of us are going to get a few 5 to 7s in our lifetime. And it's, again, we'll come back to the quote that I read out. It's not about rapid change. It's dramatically reshaping. And that's important, dramatic reshaping. So some things in this new space we're in will be reshaped beyond anything we can't future-proof for that because we can't conceive of it, right? So because when you use the underground example, and what about the time where we don't actually use trains to go to work in the volume that we do now because we work differently? Or what about, let's really go with, what about if we create the ability to travel that moves us out of surface travel or below grade travel to above grade travel at an individual level, like the Jetsons type thing? And then,
or furthermore, and sorry to interrupt, but what if we revolutionize technology with the technology we already have by having autonomous, publicly owned, or at least shared vehicles that are interconnected so that they don't have to have streetlights anymore and that they are maybe pods so that my pod can be essentially connected to the system, get me everywhere to where I want to go. They turn roads into a massive public transportation system. 90% of all cars today are not in use at any given time. If we change that, then all of a sudden the underground or any public transit system in the world is rendered obsolete like that.
Exactly. So, and I think there's a really neat example, and because you invited on the cars one. The challenge they're taking on right now is the notion of, they use the example of power drills. The average person has a drill in their house, and they use it 13 minutes.
Are you talking about Airbnb? And
yeah. So their next piece is they use a drill 13 minutes in the entire lifetime of the drill being in your house, and everyone has one. Can we get into the point of sharing power drills? Now, somebody's going to say, well, sure, and my neighbor never gives that back. The whole funny thing. But that's what I mean by the London Underground example. It's like, great, so they're future-proofing to the point of which they can conceive now. And you gave a better example than mine, because mine is so futuristic and we've never got there. But the notion is that it's still based on some core principles operating as they do today. And I think we're probably doing, I'm guessing from the friends that I've been around, the networks I've been part of, we're doing a lot of that future-proofing, but still within the construct of some ways in which we can look at that particular enterprise, that particular activity today, rather than saying, and this is important, so I think the point he's making here is how, or one of the points he's making here, how do we drive adaptability and drive the ability to learn into ourselves as individuals, into our communities, and into our schools, into other enterprises, so that we're not future-proofing in today's construct. Because future-proofing is still defending something, right? The idea of future-proofing is a defense language versus saying, okay, now how do we drive flexibility, learning, adaptability, probably moreover, into into public institutions, into industry, into spaces, into government in particular. He takes a real hard line on government, and so he should. How do we drive that in? Because that's what we're doing now. We're saying, great, you've made the platforms longer. That still requires someone to get on a train and commute from West London into the heart of the city and spend an hour and a half and probably the most overheated, uncomfortable experience of your entire life. Because they really haven't made the trains much better. They can't, in one case, they literally can't make the trains better because that's where the nation tube comes from. Get on the Piccadilly line and you know you're not on the nicest train on the planet. So the platforms are longer. But I like your notion. It's like, what if we don't travel like that anymore? What if our workplace is different? What if we fundamentally, the way in which we get around cities like that is different, that we can't conceive of today, and that's a fair play.
Well, and there's a hazard here, too, that what if we choose not to do what we should do because we're so beholden to thinking of Pluto as a planet, for example?
That's exactly it. And this is where, and you and I have worked in the space before together, this is where it gets interesting. So now you talk about the lack of adaptability or lack of flexibility to change, not because you are not going to embrace the opportunity in front of you, but because you are, as your language is beholden, that you are, in some cases, individuals might be trapped, right, as individuals, and I've certainly seen that at an individual level, or in organizations, we are stuck because we've either made a major investment. CRMs are a really good example in the space I work in. Once you invest in a CRM, and if they don't adapt, you've put in 7 figures plus into this enterprise that drives your whole business, and yet you know that there's better available technology available to you literally around the corner.
Well, and this is why people stay in cults, right? Because they've made a sacrifice. They don't stay in cults because they continue to believe these things, although they do, but they actually choose to believe in these things because they've made sacrifices. And because when someone makes a sacrifice, that sacrifice must be made worth it in the end. I have to live up to all the time and energy and blood and sweat and tears that I put into this. I can't possibly give it up now. And investors do that. I'm not just talking about investors in society. I'm talking about actual stock investors who just, no, I put so much energy and money into this, I can't let it go as it's just tanking, right? And so, Mark, my last question to you, because we are getting towards the end, is what have we missed here that you wish we could have talked about? And if we had another episode of this podcast, another hour, what would you really want to dig into? And before you answer, I'll give you mine, which is inequality. So in the afterword of Friedman's book, in the paperback edition, Friedman actually talks about how in 1980, 76% of the national income of the United States went towards wages. Today, it's just around 50%. So, I mean, this is an obvious decline of wage growth, but it's actually precipitous in its drop. We mentioned inequality before, but I think that although it's nice that he mentions it in the afterword, he actually doesn't tackle this problem, and that makes me, I'm overall an optimist like you, or applied hopeful, or whatever we want to call it. But I'm a pessimist when it comes to inequality because I don't see anything being done to turn it around. And that is, again, a first principle. If we don't fix that problem, then we won't be able to fix any other because it's leading us to a terminal point, a singularity, whether that's a collapse of our society or a point in which we are terminally unequal. So that would be my thing that I'd want to address for an hour if we could, amongst many others. There are so many quotes and interesting ideas in this book. I mean, I didn't even look at my notes for the things that we could be talking about here, but that would be my thing. So Mark, what would your thing be if you had another hour to talk about this?
And I think, like you, this book is just phenomenal. Like, it really, I mean, you can see that it's the end of a life's body of work for him, and he talks about that in so many ways, and that's what I love, is that you could literally examine each page as part of a
even the last fifth of it, which was a memoir in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say there are two things that I wish we had spoken about, and one will be related to your inequality piece. So I'll start with that. That he does he does talk about inequality. He doesn't address it. Maybe in other ways, but I think he does come towards it, and I think that's what he's inviting us to do. That if we accept these three accelerations, these three forces accelerating at the rate they are, and that they are both individually and collectively, and the point is the collectively, the integration of it all, putting us in a space and time where we are experiencing that dramatic reshaping on a regular basis. That the invitation, I think, is for us to say, well, then how do we use these forces, this acceleration, this period of acceleration, to provide access. So I was thinking about the term quite a bit. And so what is the role of government policy? What's the role of the local MP? What's the role of education? Well, it's to address the inequality. One of the things we can do well is to address inequality not by defining the outcome, but ensuring that we open up the access for individuals to take advantage of things that have been traditionally extremely difficult, right?
Equality of opportunity.
Exactly. We can provide somebody access to a better healthcare in a remote part of Canada. We live in a large country and I've lived in one of those remote places. And so how do we use these things available to us so that people are getting the best services the best way, which is reasonable to deliver in that particular area? Education is, I don't know healthcare. I'm not going to pretend that's my specialty. Education, I've got some understanding of it. I look and go, wow, then how do we use these forces in a way that we're doing some of it, but not nearly enough, I would suggest. And so that to me is this: we address inequality by accepting these three forces as real, the connection point between them, and then using those to provide, I think, opportunity and accept the connection point between people and opportunities in ways that maybe we're not doing currently. And again, lots of this is happening. I don't want to come because it's not a doomsayer thing. That's why he has so many examples, because there's a lot of it happening already. Let's just keep going. That's the optimist part. Let's just keep doing this because we can address some pieces. The second related piece, so I did say I would prefer we talk about two things, is because he does start to get into, and you mentioned is a bit of a personal story. The title of the chapter is this, always coming back to Minnesota, which is where he's from. And it makes, phenomenal that he grew up in the city and school that he did with that many notable figures from one particular area. That part I actually jumped past. It's like, great, you're almost name dropping, but it was important to the story he was telling, is that he talks about the how, and he uses an American construct. And I was, again, for me, thinking about the American versus the UK or the Canadian examples. But he does talk about the power of community. And we have to push ourselves past what some of us would use as a traditional definition of community, because communities can be communities of interest, they could be geographic, they could be cultural. There's lots of different ways in which communities come together. But the power of the community, and in this, one of the examples he uses is around government communities, which is the one that the power in that particular, those bodies in grasping the opportunities provided us through the accelerations. So it doesn't need to be, in fact, that they probably are better suited. That's the point. He's gone all the way through. He's had this big pause in his life, and he's come back to, in his particular area of suburban Minnesota, St. Paul, right? That the way and he drew it way back from his childhood, this community and how they were able to leverage the things around them to make good for the people, and not just the people, by the way, within a closed community. There's open communities, and that's a really important feature of what he's writing about. That if we have an open community, an inclusive community, and we have communities of communities connecting together, that's how we best take advantage of these opportunities for us. That's this piece. That's it. I just keep coming back to reading that and going, wow, because that's the optimist piece. That's the part of the book. Great, you've done a great story. Thank you, Friedman, for that. And you've, I think, captured very, very well the reality of the scenario in, and I happen to like the idea that he's addressing all the three of these forces and pulling together. That's all interesting. 300 pages of make me think, open me up, right? You asked, so what would you do in education? Well, I'd open people up to the premise of the conversation. He's done that brilliantly. And then he comes and uses, I think, again, he's quite good at using real life examples and then putting construct around it or story around it. I'm inviting you now to think about, what could we do? How do we address some of the inequalities that are still occurring, or actually in some cases have been heightened by this acceleration or amplified by the acceleration? How can we use communities in their form in which people connect to them? So local community or cultural community or communities around interest. Certainly the digital world has provided people a connection point to communities of interest that you could not have imagined back in the day. I moved countries when I was a young person, you know that. I lost touch with every person I went to school with because we were pen pals for as long as we could possibly do that. I've moved countries a couple times since. Guess what? I don't lose touch with people anymore. I write them an email. So there's a power there. And I think that's an important piece of the book that people should look to. So you get through the whole thing. Then he invites us into the dialogue and says, okay, what are you going to do? And how can you start to use the community? And when I say local, I get worried that people will think it's the neighborhood around them, because it's absolutely not that. It can be.
Well, and I think that what can be local can be what is shared. And it doesn't have to be what is next to you. It can be what is shared. Yes, I share the same street as other people, but I also share ideas with other people. And the internet makes things local regardless of geography. And there's an image I had in my head as you were talking there, which is that it sounds to me like to be an optimist in the 21st century, it's no longer to look for the silver lining in the cloud. It's to accept the color of the cloud as it is and use that as what it's going to be, and kind of ride this, not just ride it, but turn it in the direction that we need, whether it's Moore's Law, Mother Nature, or markets, globalization, climate change, or technological change. We can't, yes, it's going to happen regardless. So how do we adapt to it?
Yeah, and I think this is the very force that some people are now using, I think, to do damage to proper dialogue around this. And they're turning the local piece into, and whether it's geographic, it can be other, or cultural, and they're turning that into coming back to, I'm going to get around my people. We can point to the obvious example across the lake, which we're not going to do. We can point to in Canada, by the way. We've got plenty of examples here, right? And certainly point to in the UK without much difficulty at all, right? So we're using that to reinforce a closing, right? Like if we talk about globalization, it's like a pushback on that. Rather than saying, no, we can use community, that idea of community, and connecting to things that are comfortable and common to us, and that we're part of something, but in the global context. It's the global context piece. You have to, local politics within a global context. It's not local politics and therefore you're good. Don't worry about what happens down the road or happens. No, it's local politics in a global context. It's local industry development in a global context. It's local response of business and industry in a global context. It's really that piece, and I think that is in here. Certainly that's how I read it to be in here, and I think that's one of the pieces that he's inviting people like you and I who have some opportunity to be thinking about. Great, you're going to be in Kingston, I'm going to be in Calgary, and things that we're going to advocate for, things that we want to believe in, things that the people that we put ourselves around, the conversations we want to have, and you and I enjoy these conversations, we can have impact as individuals, even people like you and I who are fairly two regular guys, right? So, but within that global construct, and I think it is really important that we don't lose sight of it, because I think there are forces out there that are chopping off the sentence almost. It's like, yeah, we want to work with our local communities, and forgetting, yes, but within the global context.
Yeah, I think they're forcing us to think of Pluto as a planet still.
Yeah.
I think that they're refusing to move on and seeing this acceleration as a problem as opposed to the potential solution. Yeah. And that it's the debate, it's the dialogue that's happening now. Yeah. Mark, thank you so much for, what were we going to say?
I was going to say, and we'll never talk about this book again where we've been. We'll probably talk about it for another 10 hours today. So.
Exactly. So that'll be part 2 through 9 of this episode. Mark, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a really fascinating conversation.
It's brilliant, and you're one of my favorite people to talk to. This, and I just was so excited about this book. I've been buzzing about it for a long time. So, yeah, thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks. To learn more about Mark Sollis, go to the website whatonearthисgoingon.ca, and there you can find all previous episodes, all future episodes, and a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media to give me your feedback on this episode, on any other, and your suggestions for future episodes. Now, your quote of the week is from the book by Thomas Friedman, Thank You for Being Late, and he's quoting Dov Seidman, CEO of LRN. Here goes. When you press the pause button on a machine, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, they start. You start to reflect. You start to rethink your assumptions. You start to reimagine what is possible. And most importantly, you start to reconnect with your most deeply held beliefs. Once you've done that, you can begin to reimagine a better path. Thanks as always to our composer Andrea Wetstein. Next week, we're talking with Order of Canada winner in Calgary, Denise Clark, about creativity, performance, and living the life of an artist. I'll see you then.